billionaire asks Waitress for financial advice as a joke, but her first words left him shocked. It happened in a room where money sat like perfume in the air, thick, arrogant, untouchable. A billionaire at the top of the world, surrounded by men who fed on power, leaned back in a leather chair and asked a waitress for financial advice as nothing more than entertainment. A humiliating little party trick, a joke. But the waitress, the woman whose hands smelled of dish soap instead of wealth, spoke 5 words that made every eyelash in that restaurant freeze. 5 words that shattered egos, rewrote destiny, and launched a war the world would never see coming. They should have laughed. They should have dismissed her. But instead, they stared, because each syllable she whispered carried the weight of billions. 5 words that said she knew something she shouldn't. 5 words that promised danger. 5 words that made him afraid. But how could a billionaire fear a waitress? Who was she really beneath the cheap fabric of that uniform? What history was she hiding? Why did her eyes hold the knowledge of empires? And if this was the moment everything began to burn, how far would she go to finish the war someone else started? Let me tell you about Elena, 30 years old, unnoticed by most, a ghost gliding between tables in a place built for the powerful, the Sterling Room in downtown Chicago, the kind of restaurant where a single bottle of wine cost more than her monthly rent, where rich men negotiated their futures between medium-rare steaks and $1,000 cigars. Elena carried 4 plates at once without shaking, years of muscle memory, years of swallowing pride, years of disappearing into the background because the background was safe. People thought she was ordinary. They couldn't have been more wrong. In another lifetime, just 3 years earlier, she was Elena Rodriguez, one of the brightest financial minds of the decade, a prodigy of numbers who could move billions with a keystroke. She was the woman Wall Street whispered about, the analyst who predicted stock crashes before they happened, the brain behind investment algorithms that outperformed entire firms. And she was loyal, painfully loyal, to one man, Vincent Calloway, mentor, father figure, devil in a tailored suit. She admired him, trusted him, built him a system that printed money like magic. It made him a billionaire, and she stood proudly beside him as the world praised his genius, until she found the theft. Not the kind done with guns or masks, but the kind you hide inside decimals and bank routes across oceans. Micro frauds buried deep inside algorithmic transactions. Pennies shaved off millions, small enough to avoid suspicion, large enough to build an empire of stolen wealth. She confronted him, naive, hopeful, believing truth mattered. Instead, he crushed her. In 24 hours, her life became a crime scene. Wearing her name, offshore accounts, her signature, fraud codes traced to her computer, emails forged to look like confessions. Vincent fed her to wolves and walked away with a smile. She ran, she vanished. Her brilliance shrank down to minimum wage shifts and apartment walls thin enough to hear her neighbor breathe. 3 years she lived unseen. 3 years she carried grief like a second skin. And then one November night, fate dragged her back into the war she thought she lost. Table 7, Richard Sterling, billionaire, kingmaker, the kind of man whose decisions made markets tremble, sat surrounded by his nephew and 2 wealthy parasites who laughed too loudly at things that weren't funny. They drank aged whiskey that smelled like old money. They discussed a $40 billion acquisition as casually as weather. Elena walked past with 4 plates balanced on her arm when Daniel Sterling, young, cruel, drunk on generational wealth, saw her. "Why don't you ask the waitress for advice, uncle?" he said loud enough for half the restaurant to hear. "Maybe she has insight into $40 billion deals." Laughter erupted, the kind that cuts bone. Richard Sterling smirked, predatory, amused. The power of the moment tilted toward humiliation. He leaned back, voice dripping with arrogance. "Well, Elena," he said, reading her name tag like it was part of the entertainment. "What does someone who pours coffee think about $40 billion? She should have walked away. She had practiced invisibility for 3 years. She knew survival by silence, but then she heard Vincent's name. He was involved in the same deal. His shadow lay inside Richard's briefcase. His fingerprints were hidden in Vertex Tech's valuation reports. Something inside her that had been broken too long finally stood up. She turned, looked straight at Richard Sterling, not like a waitress, but like a strategist. Her voice was calm, quiet, deadly. "You're being set up." Forks stilled midair. Laughter died like a bullet through the room. The men who moments earlier mocked her now stared like she had swallowed lightning. And in that silence, Elena Rodriguez, the ghost, became visible again. Not as a waitress, as a threat. Nobody at that table breathed. No one blinked. Even the light seemed to dim under the weight of her words. Richard Sterling, a man who could buy a city block without checking his balance, leaned forward with slow, predatory interest. The joke evaporated. Power shifted. The room that once looked down on Elena now orbited her like she was gravity. "Explain," he said, not amused anymore, not mocking, but sharp, rigid, alert. Elena placed the last plate onto the table with unwavering hands. 3 years of swallowing humiliation had trained her to not tremble under pressure. Her voice, once muted in fear, carried the confidence of someone who finally remembered her own value. "You think you're buying technology," she said steadily, "but you're really buying debt. Hidden debt, buried under shell companies and falsified valuations." Richard's nephew Daniel scoffed, but his eyes flickered with unease. "How would you know that?" he challenged. She looked directly at him. "The spoiled prince born into wealth he didn't earn. Because I built the system Calloway used to pull this off." The name hit Richard like a slap. His eyebrows tightened. The two executives stopped chewing mid-bite, frozen like guilty statues. Vincent Calloway, the same man Richard believed himself to be competing with, unaware he was walking right into a trap, engineered by the only woman alive who could see through it. "Vertex Tech has value on paper," Elena continued, voice low but lethal. "But the patents, real research and profitable divisions, already liquidated, moved offshore. You're about to buy an empty shell. And when Phoenix Holdings declares bankruptcy, you'll drown in their debt." Silence collapsed over the table. Elena stood with 4 empty plates balanced on her arm like trophies of composure. She didn't smile. She didn't blink. She just waited. One thought echoed in Richard Sterling's mind. This waitress shouldn't know any of this, which meant she wasn't who she appeared to be. He finally spoke, voice like steel cutting glass. "Come with me." There was no request in his tone, only command wrapped in urgency. Elena looked down at her apron. 3 years of invisible survival had depended on staying small. Now she was stepping toward a past that nearly killed her. She unfastened the apron slowly, like shedding a skin, and with it she shed fear. She followed Richard out of the restaurant. No applause, no farewell, just stunned silence and the faint sound of Daniel whispering, "Who is she?" Outside, rain glossed the street like melted silver. A black Maybach waited at the curb, engine purring like wealth breathing. Richard held the door open, but before she stepped inside, he asked one question. "Your name. Your real one." She took a breath that tasted like reclaimed identity. "Elena Rodriguez." He stared, recognition flashing across his eyes like lightning. "The analyst who vanished. The one accused of fraud I didn't commit," she finished. "Framed by Vincent Calloway. He used my code, my system, my signature." Richard Sterling opened the door wider. "Get in. You're done being invisible." The city rushed past in slow streaks of neon through the window. Elena's reflection stared back at her, tired, bruised by life, but sharper than ever. When the car reached Sterling Tower, the skyscraper rose like judgment itself, glass slicing through clouds, each floor a monument to power she once commanded. Inside, every guard stood taller, every executive stepped aside. Women in tailored suits whispered, men loosened their ties. The air changed with her arrival, like the market was about to crash or explode. Richard escorted her to his private elevator. No one else entered. "Why risk exposing yourself tonight?" he asked as they ascended. "You could have walked away." Elena watched raindrops race down the glass. "Because Vincent used my genius to destroy me," she said quietly. "And now he's trying to destroy you using the same blueprint. I spent 3 years hiding. Tonight I remembered who built the empire he stole." Richard studied her, not as a waitress, but as a weapon. "Tell me what you need." "Access," she replied. "Every file, every report, every encrypted communication involving Vertex Tech, and a place to work alone. If Vincent is involved, he planted people inside your firm. He always embeds eyes where money flows." "Inside my company?" His voice dropped like a threat. "Yes," she answered, "at least one, maybe more, people who will try to stop me." For the first time that evening, Richard looked rattled. "Can you beat him?" he asked. Elena exhaled, a long, steady breath that tasted like fire. "I didn't just build the system he uses to steal," she said. "I built the one weakness he forgot to erase." Richard's elevator doors opened to a floor humming with analysts and glowing screens. Wall Street in distilled form, numbers like soldiers, capital like ammunition. Elena stepped inside that battlefield like a commander returning to war. For 3 silent seconds, the entire floor stared at the woman who once served steak. Then she took a seat, not at the guest desk they prepared for her, but at the main analytic terminal. The room watched as she laid her fingers onto the keyboard. Keys responded to her like they'd been waiting. Lines of financial architecture lit the monitors, code, transfers, anomalies only she could see. She didn't blink. She didn't breathe. She fell into the system like a diver into black water. That was how the comeback began, not loud, not dramatic, just the soft clicking of keys as a fallen legend returned to the empire she should have owned. And somewhere in the world, Vincent Calloway felt a shift in the wind, like prey sensing a hunter, because the waitress he buried was gone. Elena Rodriguez was awake, and she was coming for him. For 6 hours straight, Elena lived inside the numbers. She moved through financial architecture the way a surgeon moves through bone and tissue, precise, ruthless, unflinching. Screens glowed across her skin like fire. Millions of data points swarmed before her, yet she filtered them effortlessly, hunting patterns like familiar fingerprints in a crowded room. Sterling's analysts gathered behind her, pretending to work but watching instead. No one whispered. No one dared. This wasn't a waitress anymore. This was a woman who once commanded the flow of billions, and she was reclaiming territory like a dethroned queen returning for her crown. And then she found it. A single thread of transactions, thin, almost invisible, buried under layers of compliance reports. Payments from Vertex Tech routed through an unregistered shell corporation, Phoenix Holdings, the same name she warned Richard about. But this wasn't the shocking part. Elena expected deception. What she didn't expect was who approved the audit trail. Patricia Hayes, head of risk management, Richard's most trusted executive. Elena leaned back slowly, eyes fixed on the glowing monitors. She didn't look surprised. Betrayal was a language she spoke fluently. But Richard Sterling, he wasn't going to see this coming. He stood above the glass floor, watching her through his office window, jaw tight, sleeves rolled back like a general ready for war. He descended to the data center when he sensed the shift. "What did you find?" he asked. Elena didn't look away from the screen. "Rot," she said quietly, "deep, expensive, and internal." Richard's eyes hardened. "Show me." She projected her findings onto the 40-foot market wall display. Code illuminated the room like lightning. Auditors gasped. Gerald Thompson, chief financial officer, went pale. Patricia Hayes stiffened, lips pressed into a single guilty line. Elena stood, shoulders square, voice cold enough to cut metal. "This isn't just bad accounting," she said. "It's collaboration, fraud signed off internally. Someone inside this company has been burying evidence to push the Vertex acquisition through." All eyes turned to Patricia. She didn't flinch. She smiled. "False correlation," she said smoothly, too smoothly. "Anyone can manipulate numbers if they want to frame someone." Elena expected the denial. Vincent taught his protégés well, but Elena had more. She pulled up a secondary pattern. Offshore wires routing to Meridian Digital, Patricia's shell company. Richard's face changed, confidence draining into betrayal. "You were supposed to protect us," he breathed, voice barely above a whisper. Patricia folded her arms. "You needed this deal. You wanted it. Vincent just gave me incentive to help you sign it." Elena stepped closer, inches from a woman who once buried her own future beneath forged evidence. "Unlock the encrypted portion of the Vertex valuation," Elena ordered. Patricia's smile faltered, just slightly. "I don't have that clearance." Elena's eyes sharpened. "I know, but your biometrics do." The room went still. Patricia froze as security circled like predators. She looked to Gerald for support, but Gerald was trembling, sweat dripping down his temple. "We're not all guilty," he stuttered. Patricia was the one coordinating with Calloway. "And you signed the audit approvals," Elena said, without raising her voice. "You didn't just look the other way, you facilitated it." Gerald's knees buckled, his career, his wealth, his freedom collapsing in seconds. Patricia looked between the two men who moments earlier outranked her and realized power had already shifted. She was no longer the one in control. Her voice came out small, desperate. "What do you want from me?" Elena leaned in, quiet, lethal. "Truth," Patricia exhaled, lungs collapsing like paper. Her hands drifted toward the proximity scanner. She hesitated. Richard nodded once, a judgment without words. She placed her thumb against the biometric glass. A soft beep echoed, and the screen filled with a new directory, Project Trojan. The title alone made Elena's pulse spike. Patricia stepped back, defeated, exposed, trembling. Elena accessed the folder. Files opened like gates to hell. Fake patents, forged R&D, artificial valuation inflations, misleading international filings, debt buried under acquisition smoke, a program designed not to profit but to collapse. She turned to Richard, voice razor sharp. This wasn't a deal, it was a demolition charge. He planned to destroy you. Richard Sterling, who once smirked at a waitress, now looked at her like she was the backbone of his empire. "What's our move?" he asked. Elena didn't answer with words. She answered with action. She inserted her flash drive, her old code, her weapon, her truth. 2 columns appeared on the screen. Left, 2019 fraud code, Vincent's first crime. Right, 2025, Vertex fraud code, identical line by line. She let the silence speak, let the room witness the confession written in Vincent's own architecture. Auditors stared. Executives swallowed fear. Patricia crumbled. Then a voice echoed across the data floor. Rich, smooth, venomously amused. "I always said you were the brightest mind I ever trained." The entire staff turned toward the elevator, and walking out of the doors, Armani suit, Cold smile, wolf-like confidence, stood the man who built an empire from shadows. Vincent Calloway. Elena's heart thudded once, not in fear, but in memory. Richard stepped forward, furious. "You're trespassing. Security will drag you out in chains." Vincent smirked, the same smirk he wore the day he destroyed her. "I wouldn't call security." He lifted a phone between his fingers like a threat. "Because one word from me and your stock loses $8 billion by morning." Executives gasped. Elena didn't move. She stared him down, eyes unblinking, voice steady. "Hello, Vincent." The wolf bared his teeth in a smile. "I missed you, kid." The war was no longer silent. It was standing face to face, breathing the same air, waiting for blood. For a moment, no one breathed. The man who stole billions, who built an empire out of shadows and lies, stood in Sterling Tower as if he owned the floor beneath his shoes. Vincent Calloway scanned the room with calm, predatory eyes. Elena met his gaze without flinching. The student had returned to face her teacher. Richard Sterling stepped between them, fury in every line of his body, but Elena placed a hand on his arm. "No," she murmured. "This is my war." Vincent chuckled, slow and indulgent, like a lion amused by a house cat that dared to bare its teeth. "You always did insist on center stage, Elena. Shame you vanished before the audience could applaud. Tell me." He tilted his head, eyes gleaming with cruelty. "Did they clap louder when you delivered drinks or when you scrubbed tables?" Gasps rippled through the analysts. Elena didn't blink. "They'll clap when you're in prison." The insult hit like a blade. Vincent's jaw tightened. "So dramatic," he sneered. "But you have nothing. Your word versus mine." Elena turned toward the glowing market wall. The two columns of matching code, side by side, like twin witnesses testifying in silence. "I don't need words," she said. "I have proof." Vincent's mask cracked, not fully, just a hairline fracture of panic. "You have fragments. Nothing admissible, nothing traceable." Elena gently set down the hard drive she carried everywhere like a scar. "I backed everything up," she said. "Not just the code, emails, transfer logs, internal memos, your voice messages, your commands, your offshore authorization chain. Every crime you committed is cataloged and time-stamped." The room held its breath. Vincent froze. She had not just uncovered his scheme, she had kept his original one. He stepped closer, voice low and venomous. "You destroy me. You destroy yourself. You executed those transactions. Your signature is on them." "No," Elena corrected softly. "Your algorithm forged my signature, but I wrote a backup time-stamped before your edits. A version of code only I could have created, stored offline, untouchable." Several analysts whispered. Richard understood. This wasn't a mistake, Vincent repeated. It was the same crime, cloned, and Elena now held two identical fingerprints tying him to both. Vincent saw realization spreading across the room like wildfire. Desperation crept into his voice. "We both know how this ends, Elena. You expose me and your name resurfaces with mine. You'll go to trial. They'll question everything. They'll drag you across the news, call you complicit, call you criminal, drag your mother." Elena smiled, a slow, devastating smile. "You think I'm afraid of the truth? I walked into this building wearing a waitress apron. I have nothing left to lose." She stepped forward, close enough to smell the cologne she once associated with brilliance. "But you do." Vincent lunged, hand raised, rage tearing through his facade. He never touched her. Security intercepted him mid-strike, slamming him to the ground. His phone skidded across the floor. Richard picked it up, eyes burning. "You built your power on illusion," Richard said. "But Elena, she built hers on truth." Sirens wailed from the street below. dozens of them, climbing the tower. In waves, not police, federal agents. Richard didn't call them. Elena did, 30 minutes earlier when she plugged in the drive. They had been listening the whole time. Agents stormed the floor, badges raised, voices sharp. Vincent Calloway, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, embezzlement, securities manipulation, offshore laundering, and corporate sabotage. Vincent's eyes widened. You set me up, he hissed at Elena. She crouched beside him, face calm, voice quiet enough only he could hear. No, Vincent, you set yourself up. I just made it visible. He was dragged away, screaming threats that broke into pleas. Elena, please, we can fix this. Let's talk. Don't do this, Elena. She didn't look back, because power is not revenge. Power is moving forward without the person who once controlled you. 3 months later, courtroom lights burned like judgment. Vincent sat pale and hollow behind the defense table. No tailored suit could make him look powerful again. The evidence Elena provided was airtight. 2 mirrored systems, 2 crimes, same architect. He pled guilty, 40 years. When the gavel fell, Elena exhaled for the first time since she fled her old life. The world finally knew the truth. The prodigy they once condemned had been innocent, and the empire that tried to bury her paid in blood. 6 months later, Chicago glittered beneath her office window. Elena Rodriguez, head of global strategy, her name printed in gold outside her door. Analysts deferred to her. Rivals feared her. Headlines called her the woman who rewrote Wall Street. Richard Sterling sometimes stood in her doorway, 2 coffees in hand, one bitter, one sweet, a silent acknowledgement of where she came from. On a rooftop one night, wind soft against the city skyline, Richard asked quietly, after everything, was revenge enough? Elena didn't answer immediately. She looked out at the world that once cast her aside, now carried in her hands. Revenge gave her truth, but rebuilding gave her life. She took a slow sip of coffee, the same cheap roast she served to suits, who never saw her. It wasn't revenge, she said softly. It was reclamation. Richard smiled. You deserve everything you built. She nodded, eyes reflecting the city like fire on glass. They thought I was just a waitress, she whispered. They forgot the waitress was once the architect of empires. Her story didn't end in survival. It ended in sovereignty, because Elena Rodriguez didn't just escape hell. She redesigned the exit, and the world would never again mistake her silence for smallness.